All right, let's start. My name is Polina Sadovskaya. I'm a director for Eurasia and Advocacy at PEN America, and I'm excited and honored to welcome you at the Kremlin's attacks against dissident voices. PEN America is a 100-year-old organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to defend free expression in the US and abroad, especially when these rights are under attack. First, I would like to thank our partners, New York University's Institute for Public Knowledge, who hosted us today, as well as Human Rights Watch and Crisis Action, who helped bring some of our speakers to New York. PEN America has always hosted dissident writers from around the world in order to bring their voices to American audiences. Many of the writers we work with are subject to censorship in their own countries and often are banned and stigmatized in other countries. Our mission is always to show solidarity with these writers and elevate their voices. We believe that writers and literature are powerful tools to catalyze change and build bridges across divisions. PEN America has a dedicated Eurasia program since 2016, and I have been working closely with sister PEN centers and writers in Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Armenia, and Georgia. We have organized trips for American writers to these countries, including to Ukraine after the start of the Russian full-fledged war. We invited writers from Eurasia to participate in our World Voices Festival. We organized a Russian-American poetry translation symposium called Your Language, My Ear, a project that speaks directly to the transnational, emancipatory, global Russophone world that must eventually outlast and eclipse any and all conceptions of culture bound narrowly to the Russian state and its criminal ambitions and geopolitical machinations. We are honored to have the first United Nations Special Rapporteur on situation with the human rights in Russian Federation, Mariana Katzarova. With us today, joined by Elena Kostyuchenko, the author and brilliant journalist from Novaya Gazeta, the Russian media forced to close amid many others after the start of the Russian war in Ukraine, and Sergei Davidis from Human Rights Center Memorial, last year's Nobel Peace Prize laureate, in a discussion moderated by the award-winning author, Gary Shteyngart. So I'm going to turn to Gary now and looking forward to a great discussion.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. Thank you, NYU. And this is a subject, I can't think of a more important subject to talk about these days, not just for dissidents within Russia, but obviously for the population suffering in Ukraine and elsewhere, and the greater world beyond, the world where illiberalism looks more attractive to various populations. Let me briefly introduce, I know they were briefly introduced already, but the three panelists today. We have Elena Kostyuchenko, who was born in Yaroslavl, Russia in 1987, began working as a journalist when she was 14, which is beyond belief for me. When I was 14, I was not journalism-ing. Spent 17 years reporting for Novaya Gazeta, which was the last major independent newspaper. And in March 2022, she crossed into Ukraine to cover the horrors committed in Russia's name there. And Novaya Gazeta was shut down that spring, I believe. And returning home now would probably mean a large period of imprisonment, 15 years or more. She's also the author of 2 books published in Russian, Unwanted on Probation, and We Have to Live Here. Now, has that book just been translated into English? Is that the one? No, it's a separate book.
Yeah, it's a separate one, a new one.
A new book, which is called I Love Russia, right?
Yes.
And whose title we're going to discuss with gusto soon, and is also the recipient of the European Press Prize, the Free Media Award, and the Paul Khlebnikov Prize. Then we have Miss Mariana Katzarova. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
I'm not Russianizing it too much.
I'm not Russian either.
I know, I'm saying you're Bulgarian. I don't want to over-colonialize it. But was appointed as the special rapporteur of the situation of human rights in the Russian Federation by the UN Human Rights Council. and also led the UN Human Rights Council mandated examination of human rights situation in Belarus, and also during the conflict in Ukraine, and also going back as the Amnesty International investigations of human rights into Russia and the two Chechnya conflicts. And then also going back even further, working with human rights during the Bosnia war, during the war in Bosnia. So this is quite an incredible many decades of service to human rights. And the special rapporteur, sorry, my French does not exist. The special rapporteur's mandate was created by HRC Resolution 5125, which cites concern over, quote, the significant deterioration of the situation of human rights in the Russian Federation, in particular, the severe restrictions on the rights to freedom of opinion and expression, peaceful assembly and association, resulting in systematic crackdowns on civil society organizations. And that, I think, is going to be a major topic of what we're going to talk about today. One thing I realized as I was looking at your bio was that special rapporteurs are not UN staff, and are independent from any government or organization. They serve in their individual capacity and do not receive a salary for their work, which as a New Yorker is so mind-boggling to do something for free. Yes, you are saints. I don't know how you do it, honestly. Yes, and Sergei Davidis is head of the Political Prisoner Support Program of the Nobel Prize 2022 winner Memorial, and the co-chair of the new informal formation created after the Russian authorities liquidated the Memorial Human Rights Center. And every Russian knows about the Memorial Human Rights Center, one of the most incredible organizations to have come out of the Soviet Union. For many years, Davidis has been responsible for compiling the lists of Russian political prisoners published by Memorial Human Rights Center, and he's an active participant and organizer of national and international advocacy for political prisoners. And he coordinated the report, quote, Political Prisoners and Political Repressions in Russia in 22, published by Memorial in English, and whose main findings we will be talking about at this event today. This is very exciting for me because I think I've encountered a lot of the fields that all of you work in, but from a more, from a less formal, less professional perspective. In fact, the last project I did was a piece I wrote for the Atlantic Monthly and the Süddeutsche Zeitung together, in which I was put into a hotel room for 5 days, locked in, and forced to watch Russian state television for 5 days straight with different monitors representing different channels of different state-run media channels. The experiment was very detrimental to my health, as you can imagine. It was absolutely frightening. The level of, I don't even know how to put it, genocidal ideation in some ways directed toward groups like Ukrainians, a huge part of it, and even larger part, I think, of the vitriol was directed at LGBTQ plus citizens, and more, and even a larger part toward Westerners as a group, and occasionally a clever swipe at Jews as a group. All of this created for a very large, spicy meatball of propaganda that was very systematic, and you can certainly see how a government, not just a bunch of people sitting around television desks, but an entire government had brought all of this together. So to me, this is fascinating to get into the kind of nitty-gritty of how all this comes together. So I will be asking some questions for a little bit, and then we will open it up to the audience. And I'm just going to go around, and I'll start with Mariana. And a very basic question, can you just tell us about the special rapporteur mandate and its main findings? And also, if I may sort of shoehorn into that question, what is it like to work in a country that you cannot enter? And how does Russia, by which I mean the government, react to the mandate and to your work?
So the special rapporteurs of the United Nations are two types. One are a group of thematic experts, and they cover issues like torture, the variety of human rights issues, special rapporteur on migrants or on minorities, on torture, on human rights defenders. And then there is a selected group of special rapporteurs on country situations where the Human Rights Council, the member states, have decided that the situation merits a special attention. An independent expert that will be monitoring, observing the situation and reporting to the UN. So then the governments could actually take action, vote a resolution, make recommendations on that country. So what's really significant here is that the Russian civil society and the international civil society have been, and I see, apart from Tana Lukshina, I see also other old friends and colleagues from Human Rights Watch. Jim Ross is here in the audience. I know that, and maybe many more, I just don't know who you are. But I know that the international NGOs, the PEN Center as well, the FEDH, with Sasha Kulaeva representing from France, that organization, and now Crisis Action, have been really trying for a long time to get the United Nations to pay attention to the situation of Russia and to appoint a special rapporteur to have such mandate, which means putting a focus, shedding light on the situation regularly every year, once reporting to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and once reporting, what I will be doing tomorrow for the first time, to the government's members of the General Assembly in New York. And the General Assembly are bosses of the Human Rights Council, so they appoint them. And that wasn't possible at all. It was impossible because somehow governments, businesses, everybody, law firms, everybody wanted to do business with Russia for a long time. And suddenly it was really the war on Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine last February, that suddenly opened the eyes of the international community to a situation which started in my report. I'm talking about the past 2 decades of deterioration, of clampdown on civil society, on independent media, gradually. And that really began, I would say, with Mr. Putin coming to power over and starting the second war in Chechnya. And after that, it was what we've been seeing is really a graduate deterioration, which now peaked since February last year. The mandate became possible, and suddenly governments voted. And I've been saying a lot that suddenly, the skies have opened, because the resolution giving birth to this mandate was adopted on 7th of October last year. And that's the day, not only of the birthday of Mr. Putin, but this is the date when Anna Politkovskaya, somebody I very much respected, a close friend of mine, and a good colleague and friend of the human rights people here, and a role model for Elena, from what I've heard from her interviews before, because she's young. When Anna was killed on 7th of October, 17 years ago. And other human rights defenders were killed, and other journalists were killed to silence them over the Chechnya war, over their work as lawyers, as journalists. And Anna was particularly that single voice of a Russian journalist, almost single-handedly reporting on the horrors that the civilians in Chechnya faced, to which there hasn't been justice to this date, to the majority of the crimes in Chechnya. So 7th of October was an important date. The mandate was born. I'm the first mandate holder. I went through a competition, international one, for 6 months. So I started in my role only on 1st of May, which is a very short period of time. Many of my colleagues generally don't really issue reports. They just issue their vision for the mandate, and then they wait for a year to publish their first report. But I felt the situation in Russia is so critical at the moment. It's so really important that I come up with this report, and it's the first for the UN system, with recommendations to the government. The reaction of the government was that they don't recognize my mandate as in principle, nothing personal. But of course, I requested access to the country. I requested meetings with them repeatedly. None of this was granted. And then there was an interview by the ambassador in Geneva on Russian television, which probably became personal because I was actually for 5 seconds even upset a little because it was so untrue. He called me an active Russophobe. And a friend of mine said, come on, you should pay for such a good, publicity. I said, but it's not true. I really, you have to so much love the Russian people and the people of that country. And I worked in this region almost all my life. It just happened in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Russia, that, to do this intense job of a special rapporteur, uncharted territory, because it's the first, there is no one to imitate or to continue their work, very politicized, highly politicized, and being really observed by everybody, by all member states, left, right, and center, whether you're fulfilling your mandate, and at the same time keeping independent, keeping really centered, without personal likes and dislikes, without personal, observations or baggage, who we like and who we don't like, but really a mandate that is not investigatory. I'm not an investigator, which I've been in my past, of human rights violations, but actually, a monitor, an independent observer, a voice, and a bridge between the Russian people, the Russian civil society, the victims of human rights violations, and the world governments. So how is it possible, or how difficult it is to work on a country where you cannot enter? It is very difficult, but I want to really salute and express my gratitude to the Russian human rights activists, human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, victims of human rights violations, who many of them came out of Russia to meet with me, to meet with my mandate, to deliver information or to write to my mandate about their what they've been through, risking sometimes, really risking a lot to face reprisals for contacting the active Russophobe and the UN mandate on Russia. Why this mandate is significant and why it's important to preserve it for the future as a mandate, because it's really calling to account for the first time one of the big 5 countries, permanent members of the Security Council. These are the countries, we just come from the UN, our group, and there was like madness at the Security Council at the moment, meeting around what's happening in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, which was really on a very high volume at the moment. And all day long, they're meeting in an emergency meeting to actually decide what's the way forward. What would it be? Would it be peace? Would it be a massive destruction of the whole region? And I think a country like Russia, which has a veto, which has an important voice, to have this projector directed at its protection of human rights or violation of human rights in their own country is an extremely important historical moment, because nobody is above the law or the rules of the United Nations. Nobody is above the international law. And this is what this mandate demonstrates. So I think the next one, hopefully, will be another one that is not performing, not defending the rights of their citizens. The big 5s are not untouchables. This is what this mandate proved.
No, those are 2 of the important things I think that you mentioned. One, yes, this is the first time that a P5 country has been appointed a rapporteur, and in fact, others may debate whether Russia in its current state even belongs in the P5, and that's a separate question. And the other thing you mentioned that I liked was, yes, being called a Russophobe these days is usually an indication that you really love Russia and hope for the best for that country. Does anyone else also, I want other people to chime in if you have anything to add or questions, Elena or Sergei, for her based on what she said.
I know the report. I highly appreciate the impact Mariana made, and it's very important, but it would be strange to ask questions in this situation.
You can add any comment too if you.
Actually, it is very important that this report appeared, and it sheds light to human rights situation in Russia, not because I'm involved in the activity connected with human rights and political prisoners, and not only because of some humanitarian reasons or legal reasons, but also because of pragmatical reasons. It's important because human rights violation inside our country are the reasons and the grounds of the external aggression. And then, unfortunately, the world used to pay too little attention to these violations, to these problems earlier, even after 2014. And both Russian human rights defenders and international human rights defenders tried to attract attention to these problems, but everybody wants to hope that everything will be solved somehow by itself, and close eyes to predictable consequences of this situation. But now it's impossible to close eyes, and at least now it's important to speak not only about the result, about the war. For sure, it's very important to support Ukraine and document war crimes and so on. But it's impossible to speak only about it and not to pay attention to the reasons, to what happens in Russia. Because, as I already said, it's the ground of this, and we see that Russian regime had been preparing for the start of this full-scale aggression many years in advance. Actually, 20 years of Putin's rule somehow were the preparation, but the last 2 years before aggression were the period of intensive preparatory work, and then our legal entities were shut down. Alexei Navalny was imprisoned, Andrei Pivovarov, former head of Open Russia, was imprisoned, and Navalny structures was declared to be extremist organizations, and a huge set of restrictive, I don't understand legislation. I wanted to say that it wasn't necessary for the state then to accept this legislation to control the society. And it was especially prepared for this new situation with new risks and new turbulences. And it is important because now, when sufficient part of Russian of the Russians supporting human rights and democracy are in exile, and those who are inside the country are very limited in their public possibilities to act publicly. Support to those who are the victims of persecution is a base for coordinating. It's, I would say, a base for a point of collecting of civil society, both inside and outside the country. And the last thing I was asked to comment, but
No,
decided
please,
to speak too long, I think. But the last thing I wanted to add to this comment is that it's important to speak about now, because anyway, the war will be ended somehow. We hope that it will be ended by the Ukrainian victory, but when the war will be ended and there will be some talks about settling the situation, it's important not to forget about these issues. And this threat exists. When they stop shooting, they probably a lot of people will decide, let's stop speaking about human rights, let's just launch our business and so on. But it's important to speak about these issues today in order to make it impossible to put aside the issue of human rights in this situation. And for sure, issues of human rights should be included in the settlements as condition of lifting sanctions and so on. Excuse me.
No, and I just want to emphasize, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think that we never focus on human rights problems unless a brand of aggression really happens, unless some naked aggression happens. People are dying in vast numbers, there's a war, any one of these things. But otherwise, well, there's a side note in a report here or there, tucked away here and there. But for example, I mean, in America, very few people, I think, really understand what the level of repression against individuals in Russia. We obviously see the war against Ukraine and we see pictures of those deaths, but we don't quite see what's happening within Russia. For example, most Americans would not know that Vladimir Kara-Murza has been jailed for 25 years, even though he's very prominent as a cultural and political figure in Russia. And now Americans know that our Wall Street Journal reporter is in prison because he's American. He is constantly featured on TV, as well he should be. But I think it's true that many Americans don't follow the intricacies of this, but we have to preempt these things before they happen, because obviously a lack of civil rights within a country can very easily lead to the kind of even the very least recent conflict that we're seeing in the world. Elena, for many years you have worked at Novaya Gazeta, which was a leading, or maybe even the most leading independent newspaper in Russia. Could you tell us briefly what happened to Novaya Gazeta and what is your current situation?
Well, I was working in Novaya Gazeta for 17 years. It's like half of my life, and it's like the best half of my life. So then full-scale invasion had started. I was sent to Ukraine from Novaya Gazeta to report on Russian invasion. And I mean, on that point, I believe not right away, but probably in a week, we already would understand that it's just a matter of time how long we would be able to exist. And we were able to exist for 32 more days. And this time, then, like, all of us were doing just our best, and readers were responding accordingly. Just like every day, we have 4 or 5 million readers on our website, because we had like people reading, writing from Ukraine, and it wasn't just me, it was our Ukrainian correspondents, and it was people writing about what's happening in Russia. And when we basically got the second second warning from Roskomnadzor. This is like a Russian censorship agency. In Russia, we have a special state agency which is performing censorship. And according to that warning, our media license could be taken away. So people of Novaya was voting, and they want to shut down like for a while. So when situation would be better, we could continue our work, but didn't really work out for us. We took our media license anyway, and now Novaya Gazeta does not exist officially, but factually, of course, we are alive and we are working. So some people from Novaya Gazeta left Russia, and they established Novaya Gazeta Europe, and like they're doing their best. And some people from Novaya Gazeta stayed in Russia and keep working there without even having media license, without having the right to be called journalists, without have any kind of legal protection. But I mean, technically, not technically, I don't know. I mean, we didn't have legal protection either before, but still, like, you know, it's nice to have a status. Now we don't have it. And we're working tremendously good, though our website is blocked in Russia, but we found some other channels to spread information like YouTube and Telegram, and strangely speaking, PDFs, because Novaya Gazeta is making PDF versions, and it's like downloadable, so people download it and print it out, so everybody can print their own Novaya Gazeta, though we can't print our issues legally anymore. And one of these people who's working from Russia is my younger sister. She's an investigative reporter as well. And I'm extremely proud and extremely scared, both. We recently talked, and like this kind of sister talks or journalist talks, we don't really divide these things. And I'm like, what are you working now? And she's like, I'm working on this. And I'm like, what you gonna do next? And she's like, I don't know. And I'm like, why don't you know? And she's like, right now we have like one day ahead of us. So like what you can do for one day, you plan for that. And then if you have another day, you keep doing that. If you don't, so you don't. And she says, like, then I leave my place. I never know if I will be able to return back home. So it's like complete new reality what my colleagues are facing in Russia. And I believe they're true heroes. And I'm really happy to be here to be able to tell you about that, about their work. And the danger we're facing is tremendous. Just a few months ago, my colleague and my friend Elena was brutally attacked in Chechnya. And it wasn't just, I'm sorry for saying, regular beating, what happens from time to time with any of us. They basically tried to break your fingers, saying, we're gonna break it so you won't be able to write. And they were torturing her to get password from her phone. So this way they would know her sources and her contacts. And though they were torturing her, she didn't tell them the password. And lawyer who was with her, they stabbed him with a knife. And this is kind of new level of violence, which was unimaginable before, though, as Mariana said, like we had like murders of journalism all day long, but not like breaking fingers and stabbing with a knife. Like it's kind of something different what we are facing now. And another thing what is extremely important to understand, and I'm sorry going to boring legal stuff, we have new 2 articles in criminal code and administrative code which are basically criminalizing the profession. One of them is so-called like deliberately false information on Russian army. It's basically any information which is controversial, this official information from Minister of Defense. It's to spread this information it's up to 15 years in prison. And another article, so-called discreditation of army. And it's not even necessary to say something. You can react, you can post like in social media, it's enough. If you discuss it in public place and somebody would call the police, you also can be, caught for this crime. And if you even talk in private phone conversation, but your phone is wired, well, it's not considered as a private phone conversation because 3 people are in, right? So yeah, you also can be prosecuted for that. And it's what's happening. And despite of all of that, I believe it's also very important to know that there is like a new generation of very young reporters, like 18 years old, 19 years old, 20 years old, who never worked in journalism before, but who went into profession right now in the most darkest times to be able to describe what's happening with our country, what's happening with other people. And I'm very proud to consult them from abroad, like to give them the skills and tips I have, though most of them are not really like applicable to the new situation, but still for them it's important to feel that they are not alone. And for me, it's so important to know that they exist. So it's like win-win situation. And what about me? Well, my life is ruined. Like everything what I had is lost, except of people and their love. I still have it. Probably you are aware of my recent health issues. Berlin police right now is investigating my suspected poisoning. So there is still no results of investigation. So I can't tell anything new, but it's quite a long time to recover. And you know, for me, because I always define myself through my work, and now my health doesn't let me to work in the field as I did like 17 years before. It's very hard psychologically, and even more hard for me that I cannot go back to my country, to my people, and that my fate right now somehow separate from their fate. And I don't feel great about it. I feel awful. But I'm very happy that you all came, and now I can speak with you and I can share my thoughts and my experience. And for me, it's very significant. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. That was very moving. And I was going to ask a follow-up about whether independent journalists still work inside Russia, but I think in so many ways you've answered that question. The answer is yes, but with a lot of bravery and with a lot of techniques that have existed since Soviet or even Tsarist times of trying to get around the authority. I did not know about the Nova Gazeta PDF, which sounds like some kind of
And it works.
digital samizdat or something crazy like that. But it works, you say, yeah.
Yeah, it does. Actually, now we took a lot of practices back from Soviet Union.
Yeah, yes. That's great. I mean, I'm sorry, that's not great.
It's not great.
It's great that we're, yes.
It's not great.
Any additional comments or questions from either of you? Sergei, you are co-chair of Memorial, which was a co-laureate of the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize, for which I congratulate you and Memorial, and which was shut down by the government a few months before the Nobel Prize Committee's announcement. Can you tell us a little bit about the organization, which I'm sure many of you know about, and certainly anyone who grew up in Russia has heard quite a bit about, but tell us why you think the government views you, such a storied organization, as an enemy.
I am co-chair only of one of memorial organizations, for sure, Human Rights Defense Center Memorial, and there is a huge network of memorial organizations, an International Association of Memorial Organizations, and so on, just for clarity. Now, after the war was unleashed, many other human rights, civil society organizations were liquidated: Moscow Helsinki Group, Center Sava, Sakharov Center, and others. Actually, it continues idea I tried to express in my previous comment that the state have to suppress all the points where civil society can be organized, around those civil society can be organized, united, and it began from the most obvious and the most forceful, if possible to say so, organization, as which Memorial was. Two our legal entities shut down by court decision, a historical memorial, and our Human Rights Center, which was mainly involved in the issues connected with current human rights violations. We were allowed, we were respected, so they could predict that our voice after the planet war began will be listened. And they tried to eliminate all the obstacles for the war. And we were only the first. For sure, it was somehow symbolic, because they also compete with the civil society for the past Generally, Putin's regime, it's rather commonplace, looks not to the future, but to the past. And since a sufficient part of Memorial's activity is connected, not our organization, but Memorial in general, is connected with the historical memory, it's very dangerous for the state. Current state declares that Russian state was always great and victorious in every time, both Tsars and Bolsheviks and Stalin and everybody, probably besides of Khrushchev and Gorbachev.
Gorbachev for sure.
And when organization express tells about the crimes of the state, it's unpleasant for them. And they would like to get a monopoly for historical truth, for historical vision, for interpretation of history. It was the second reason why they began from us, I think.
Yeah, no, it's true, and it's also frightening to see the way the state is preparing a younger generation for this kind of patriotic, but really not patriotic propaganda in many ways. And in terms of rewriting textbooks, which I think is one of the most frightening things any government can do when the impartiality of textbooks is removed. And I think that's something that very much goes, I mean, the name of your organization, Memorial, is obviously to have a memorial to all of the people who have died because the Soviet/Russian/Tsarist state has been the state that it has been.
And Memorial was involved also in many enlightenment projects, also working with school children. They prepared every year. There was a competition of essays about historical memory of own family, of own region, and it was criticized by the authorities for many years. They were objected to assaults from some supporters of the authorities. And this was also irritating factor, I think.
Mariana, your report points out the continuity between previous Russian campaigns in places like Chechnya and Syria and their continuity in Ukraine, because there is no impunity for war crimes, right, from the people who have committed war crimes in previous wars. Could you talk a little bit more about that? About
accountability, but there is impunity.
Yes. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because it seems fascinating, because there's this entire through line of wars. And Russia, of course, is not the only country in the world that has committed war crimes during wars, but there is a very obvious connection between all of these things. And one can imagine now, with all these men coming, mostly men coming back from Ukraine, what the future for the next generation will hold, because these men will become a part of Russian society, and mostly in a very negative way, I can imagine, which will then create the fertile soil for more of this kind of behavior.
Yes, I think it's important connection that the impunity that exists or committing crimes with impunity in peacetime Russia, for example, as well. The torture in police custody, the rape, the sexual violence. I have included in the report the reports of sexual violence used and rape used against men and women, anti-war activists and anti-war demonstrators when detained after participating in peaceful demonstrations against the war in Ukraine. But yes, the roots of this rampant impunity in peacetime Russia, as well as the impunity with which war crimes are committed in the context of the war in Ukraine. I do believe it has its roots in, there was no accountability for the crimes of the two Chechen wars, particularly the second one after the coming to power of Mr. Putin was obviously quite different from the first one in intensity of perpetrating human rights violations, massive human rights violations against the civilians. And I remember, there was people who were petitioning the European Court for Human Rights at the time with their cases from Chechnya. And the federal forces, Russian federal soldiers, were just hunting down the ones that were trying to get justice through the European Court because witnesses or petitioners were not needed. I mean, unfortunately, the European Court was maybe the only avenue of getting justice outside Russia for many victims of human rights violations from the Chechen wars, but also in general from Russia. And this is no longer an avenue because Russia was suspended from membership in the Council of Europe, and then the government decided to withdraw from being party to the European Convention on Human Rights. Therefore, the court is no longer available to Russians to petition and to try and get some justice because they cannot get it at home. I mean, of course, the connection between atrocities in peacetime and with the returning soldiers that you mentioned is true for any society which is going through war, including your society as well, historically, even currently. But I think it's a matter of how you know, the government is responsible to bring to justice the perpetrators of human rights violations or war crimes. What investigations are done? Is there independent courts that could do something like that? And unfortunately, in Russia, the judiciary is really not independent. It's under political influence. It's corrupt on another level, and it's fearful. So the judiciary is not the vehicle for justice very often. And then you have the procuracy, you have the police. There is very little amount of any move to investigate the past crimes in Chechnya or the current crimes in peacetime, let alone the ones in Ukraine. But I think I spent 2 years in Donetsk at the beginning of the conflict. Yes, I was leading the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission. When this conflict began, I call it the first conflict. You know, it started in 2014. And I was there when the conflict broke up in Donetsk, and then spent 2 years there. And I firmly believe that this the current war, the full-time invasion of Ukraine, possibly could have been avoided if the international community had a different approach. If the international community stepped up their efforts and was not just going through the motions of some kind of Minsk agreements, if it was a really life and death importance for the international community to, you know, to find a peaceful solution of this conflict when it began 9 years ago. But there wasn't really, in my estimate, there wasn't, and we see it now, there wasn't substantive effort to actually resolve it. It was this hidden, you know, for 9 years, this part of Ukraine, which was, plus Crimea, which was annexed and occupied, but Donbass, which was Donetsk and Lugansk region. And it was like this black hole, you know, where fighting was continuing. You know, Russian soldiers under the pretext of being volunteers were there. But it wasn't, you know, the ICRC did not qualify this as international armed conflict of an international nature because, you know, ICRC is the custodian of the Geneva Conventions. Now, retroactively, they're saying, oh, but it was actually a war even then, not just since February. I think we need kind of reload of our international community response. And I think what's happening at the moment in Israel and Palestine is yet another manifestation of one of those unresolved black holes of our responsibility. I mean, we have the UN. I'm just one special rapporteur on one concrete country, but I think we have the machinery in the United Nations of experts. But that's not where the problem lies. It lies with the responsibility of governments who are the ones initiating action at the United Nations. For so many black holes like that in the world, I mean, do we even read on our front pages what's happening in Ethiopia, for example? Yeah, I was just about to say. I started when Anna Politkovskaya was killed 17 years ago, an award in her name, which is given in London to women human rights defenders from war and conflict zones, because it was anger making to have somebody killed only because she was, actually, Anna was from a privileged family and she chose to go to war zones, to these nasty, dark places. Not because she was desperate for money or for anything. She really was desperate for justice and for the truth. And I think she could have avoided it. She was half Ukrainian, half Russian. She's from a very prominent Ukrainian, almost royal origin, Mazepa family, who was a hero ruler in Ukraine. But I always wonder, what would she have said or done, or where would she have been? And probably similarly to Elena, she would have been in the occupied territories or in Ukraine itself, to cover this war, to write about both sides, to write about all the civilians that are suffering in the war in Ukraine for justice. But I think this thing, so the award this year, the Anna Politkovskaya Award, was awarded to a young journalist, 32 years old, who's been risking her life to bring out of Ethiopia and Tigray the massive rape of women there. Not even one perpetrator was brought to justice. Do we at all read about Ethiopia? No. I mean, our media, and I'm a former journalist, I'm class of 92 of Columbia Journalism School. Yes. I think we all, journalists bear, and editors bear responsibility. We're given what to think and what to read. And by the way, today, Russia wasn't in fashion at the UN because OPT and Israel is in fashion. I mean, how can we even think about fashion when it's about human life? It's about part of our humanity being in flames. The war in Ukraine is continuing unresolved. I mean, it's a collective responsibility of our generation, governments, civil society, people, students, special rapporteurs, journalists, writers. It's our generational responsibility for what's happening. And, I'm afraid that in several decades, when the future people look back, they'll just think of us as total barbarians, like cannibals. I mean, we've been really, really still eating each other. We're still in cannibalism state with all our modern technology. What's happening in Russia, it's turning quietly into this cave, a black hole, in the middle of Europe, a huge one, where things disappear, from people to children, to Ukrainian children, to ideas, to, I don't know, to the hope that disappears there. And I think this mandate, these NGOs and human rights defenders here needs to be supported by all of us, because they are the ones trying to preserve the focus on Russia through all times in the past 20 years and right now without fashion, and to warn us that this is how isms begin, communisms, fascisms, extremisms. They begin when a place is made into a ghetto. They begin when a place is made into a black hole with isolation of the people inside. And I actually call for, don't isolate the Russian people. We need to communicate with them. It's very fashionable to hate Russians now, all over the world. And I'm shocked because I'm Bulgarian, I'm not Russian. I was forced to study Russian. Now I'm grateful because I could speak in Russian to the Russians. But I wanted to study in an English high school, but it was for privileged kids from the Politburo in Bulgaria. And I was from a normal family. I was devastated when I was accepted at the Russian high school. I hated it. But here we are, I speak Russian. But, this fashion of now hating the Russians, hating Russian language. I mean, I've been spat at in my own country, in Bulgaria, by some nutter on the street because I was speaking Russian to a friend who happened to be a Nobel Prize winner, but
Mhm.
Belarusian literature, Svetlana Alexievich. She was visiting Bulgaria, and I was speaking to her in Russian, and Svetlana said, well, maybe I shouldn't say I'm from Belarus anymore. I should say I'm from Lithuania because, you know, it's dangerous in Sofia to speak Russian. Languages are not guilty. Peoples are not guilty. There is nothing like collective guilt in international law. All Russians are not guilty for what's happening in Ukraine. They're concrete perpetrators, and we need to identify them through the machinery of our international justice and actually bring them to account. So,
Mariana, you've given me a perfect
That's
jumping off
all.
point. Thank you, no, but you gave me a perfect jumping off point for a question for Elena, which is your book, I Love Russia, going off what you said, has just come out in the US. Congratulations. Yeah. Woo. And I heard that you got a good New York Times review, which is the only review people read in America anyway. So congratulations, that is a very good sign. Now, given the circumstances, that title, and I haven't read the book, but we'll read it as soon as I can. That title sounds a bit controversial. What's the book about and how did you decide, per what we were talking about with Mariana, how did you decide to declare, even, it could be a bit tongue-in-cheek or not, but to decide to use that very wonderfully provocative title for your book?
Well, I know it might sound provocative, but for me, it's not. I do love Russia, and I believe it's quite obvious. So this book is about my love to my country and how this love was changing during my lifetime and how this love was changing me and not always in the best possible way. And also it's a book about how Russia came into fascism. It was slow, and Mariana just said that this degradation of human rights didn't just suddenly happen in 24th of February of 2022. It started way more earlier. And so, yeah, and this is quite strange book because it has a strange structure. So it has stories, what I wrote for Novaya Gazeta for the 17 years. And this is a story of people living far away from Moscow and far away from Kremlin. They live their lives, which some of them are quite difficult. And it's also my story. And I found out that we have so many things in common because we basically share the same fate. And this is what means my country, Russia, for me, it's like the union of people who are sharing the same fate. And this fate, it's not always good one, but still it's our fate. And to love my country for me is to try to make this fate better. And I know why it can sound provocative right now, because actually it's such a Putin propaganda bullshit, because what Putin says is, if you love Russia, go kill Ukrainians. If you love Russia, be silent. If you love Russia, lie if you need to. If you love Russia, obey. But the truth is that love doesn't demand murder or obedience or lies or silence. It demands very precise look at what you love, and love demands life. And so I believe we shouldn't fall into this Putin bullshit narrative. And it's not just Putin's, I mean, right politicians all around the world are very ready to tell you what you should feel and what this feeling are obliging you to do. But I believe specifically in the time of catastrophe, as we are all now, we need to know exactly what we feel, why we feel it, and what we want to do with these feelings. And so this is my book about.
That sounds wonderful. I remember talking to the Ukrainian writer of Russian heritage at a PEN event, Andrei Kurkov, and he was saying And I'd seen Andrei a couple of years before the war in Kyiv, and we were speaking Russian on the street. It seemed like half or more than half the street were speaking Russian in Kyiv. And now he says, he feels bad, or he feels you have to kind of look around, make sure you're with the right people. And that's a strange kind of effect of Putin's war to bring everyone into the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, is that people are now in Ukraine trying to speak a lot more Ukrainian. And he said to me, we're talking about Russian literature, and he said, well, Pushkin didn't invade Crimea or Donbass, which is true. But then again, you also look at some of Pushkin's works, and then the argument continues, well, other writers from imperialist societies, Anglophone French writers, were also writing with a certain kind of boosterish quality when their countries. I mean, Chekhov I can think of as a writer everyone can just love. He never wanted to invade anybody. He just wanted to cure the serfs on his estate of many problems. But we were sitting on this stage and we're kind of going back and forth about what it means to be of a Russian culture and how much of it is poisonous and how much of it is not. And I think that differs for every person. But there's definitely, I can't wait to read your book, but if I just came across that title in a bookstore, I'd be like doing a double take, which may be a good thing.
Yes.
It could be something that lasts a long time just because people even begin by debating the title of the book, but then also getting to know your voice and everything that you have gone through puts such a different prism on what that title can be.
Okay, so these two people are responsible for the title because
No.
Yeah.
Subtitle is important.
Oh, please, the subtitle, yes.
Yeah, subtitles is great. Reporting.
It's important because you do love your country. It's just not the country that you grew up in anymore. That's heartbreaking.
That is, yeah.
It was important.
Yeah, no, agree. And what's the subtitle?
Reporting from a lost country.
Oh, that's beautiful. Okay, that's good. Ooh. Sorry, the publicist in me is excited.
Yeah, so I believe because can I actually show you how it looks
please.
like?
Yeah.
Because we basically discussing the title without actually seeing how it looks like, and it looks like that. And I believe it's beautiful enough. And
Beautiful.
yeah, so this is a wonderful photo of wonderful Russian photographer Dmitry Markov. And reporting from a lost country is quite a big thing. The problem about title, so let me tell you all the story.
I'm listening.
Yeah, so I called the book in Russian, it's called Моя любимая страна. And then I called it this way. I was completely sure that it's the simplest phrase to translate, but appeared it's not. And in so many different ways and so many different cultures, it causes some problems. For example, in Germany, they translated that Das Land, das Hliebe. And then I just approached my German friends with a manuscript. They said, what is the title? That? Oh no, you shouldn't have it. Because in Germany, with their own history, but they said that it's not safe to love country at all. I mean, you can love your family, you can love your wife, you can love your child, you can love your neighbor if you're a kind person, but not country, because if you love the country, it always would end up with blood. And I'm not the one who should argue with Germans. They paid quite a high price for their experience, for their conclusions. But still, I believe there is nothing shameful about loving your country, and what this feeling gives me strength to keep going. But at the same time, this feeling gives me hope, which blinded me for so many years. Because then you love someone or something, you just hope for the best, right? You just cannot avoid it. And I mean, then I was writing this book, the main question what I had in my head, it was question to myself, actually, I was reporting on Russian for 17 years. I was traveling all around the country and I was seeing real different things. And somehow then full-scale invasion had started. I was like, oh my gosh, what's happening? How that's possible? I mean, if I didn't recognize this war coming closer and closer, how I could blind, I don't know, international community for not recognizing that. And this blindness, it's also important thing to keep in mind. And I'm actually very happy that what is good about this title is that it's not only people who are, on, Ukrainian side would, buy this book. Quite opposite, like people, very different people can take a look and probably would buy it. And for me, it's important that people would read it, not just because I wrote it, but because for me, it's like a bit letter to my past. Because if I could warn myself, like to send a letter to my past, I would say, stay alarmed. Don't get calmed with that everyone around you says, it's gonna be all right. Like, it's not so bad. Yeah, there are some terrible things in Russia, but life is improving slowly. And one day Putin just would disappear because he would be so outdated, and we would just build a new wonderful country without fighting for it, just for doing nice small things. And I will tell myself, be alarmed, and I will tell myself, be hysterical if you need to. And I would say myself, fight for what you love. And right now, as Mariana said, so many countries are turning into quite a dangerous state. Like always, right authoritarian turn, what's happening all around the world, and probably what happened here in the United States too. It's a thing to be very alarmed about. And here I describe how slowly, step by step, you can lose your country. And it's way more easier than it seems to be. So yeah, it's reporting from a lost country.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully said. And I think we were talking earlier about preconditions, and obviously the actions of Hamas were absolutely horrifying, but the fact that Israel had begun a slide back from democracy under Netanyahu, the fact that the judicial reform that was supposed to silence his opposition was happening and to keep him out of prison is very reminiscent of all these other dots that have been happening in other parts of the world, including, as you mentioned, this country itself. We have to be very alert about what's happening in this country, because even though we think we have these very durable institutions, they just haven't been tested by the right tyrant yet. Or have been tested by one tyrant, but he's still alive. A beautiful thing that you mentioned, or I think we're running out of time a little bit, right? A beautiful thing you mentioned about some of the things that love of country. Yeah, we will have questions. Sorry, and then we'll get this one more from Sergei. One thing you said beautifully about love leading to one feeling hopeful for a country, but also on the other side, being able to blind people from the worst that their country can produce. Different people, it provokes different reactions. So again, I want to ask you, do you think, and I know you're not you're not a pollster, et cetera. I don't know how you would do polling in Russia today anyway, but do you in general believe that Russians, the mass of them, do support Putin and the war in Ukraine? or are they apathetic? And the other question is, do they even care about the idea of human rights, or did that kind of die away with the same way that the idea of democracy after Yeltsin became less of a, tough question.
So complex
Yeah,
question,
I know. I'm sorry.
demanding
Sorry.
so
Sorry.
complex answer.
Sorry.
It can be discussed whether there was real democracy under
Yes.
Yeltsin, and it's rather difficult to even to determine what we mean when speak that people support something, because if we speak them on the street, they will say yes, we support. But what does it mean? Actually, they have to answer so, not because they understand that they should deceive those who ask, but because it's much more convenient for them to feel comfortable. They know, and Elena told that she described long history of deterioration of situation. For sure, if Putin in 1991 declared everything he is doing now, he would be considered mad. It could not be imagined. And it couldn't even be imagined in 2010, 2011, even in 2013. For sure, situation was much worse than it was earlier, but current situation could not be imagined. And this war of aggression could not be imagined even in 2020, at least 2020, for sure. So I believe, to be short, that Russian people do not actively support Putin. There was no request for such a regime, and moreover for war of aggression. There is a minority, somehow outdated, as Lena told. We expect Putin will be, and he is now actually for sure. But there is also a minority of those who oppose this archaic, barbaric construction of authority, of aggression, dictatorship, and so on. And there is, unfortunately, but it's natural. It's natural. There is a majority of those who just tolerate this situation, who understand that there is no possibility to change it. They see the examples of those who are in prison trying to change anything, and prefer to live their own lives and not to compete the authorities. If it's demanded to say, I support this war and this Putin, I will tell that I support, but I'm not ready to sacrifice anything for him.
That's a great answer. And just to add a tiny footnote before I turn it over to the audience, you know, as somebody who emigrated from the Soviet Union in '79, I know many people of that generation here who don't really have a concept of what American democracy is either. They barely ever vote. They watch TV only to get angry about something, but they don't really participate in democracy or try to figure out ways in which a society can become better. It's almost like they're frozen in amber. And I think a lot of people in Russia obviously are the same way. Yeah. So on that happy note, let me open it up to our audience. And do we have microphones, or people just talk very loudly? Oh my God, NYU is, we don't have this at Columbia. We don't have these mics. Okay, you can just speak and somehow you'll be heard.
Thank you so much. So this was an amazing panel and an amazing topic, and obviously we're going to spend weeks debating this, but what we talked about primarily was what's happened in the past. How do we move forward? Ukraine, we all want, I think we all want Ukraine to win. Ukraine's not going to march on to Moscow. NATO's not going to march on to Moscow. You know, with all due respect to the UN, sanctions alone are not going to change what's happening. I've had a lot of very heated discussions with my friends and colleagues, kind of say what you're saying, not to blame all of the Russian people for what's happening, and explaining that this has been 20 years of oppression against them. But Yeah, I honestly, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little emotional, but I had hoped that, I knew that demonstrations were gonna be very dangerous and very, risky, and that's not something that people could really easily do, but I honestly thought that at some point, people were just gonna have strikes, that the Russian people would just stop working, and that maybe that would change something. But I guess I'm apologize for making this about what I thought, but how do we move from this? How do we get rid of Putin, without waiting 20 years or without waiting for whoever's going to take over after him? We have to change this somehow. What is your viewpoint?
Would anyone start?
May I?
Sure.
So obviously that Putin won't just, leave, right? And let us be. So the only way for Russia future is revolution. And I believe we all should understand it quite clearly. And what we can do from outside is to help people inside Russia to fight the regime. And there are plenty of things we can do from outside. And despite of resistance in Russia, trust me, it exists. But because of law we have right now, it's often not public resistance. But there are people who are protesting so many different ways. And there are some very impressive anti-war movements, and I would love to name feminist anti-war movement, which unites very different women from all around Russia. It has unique structure. It's basically like sote, ячейки, how to say?
Cells.
Yeah, like cells. Yeah. So basically, it's like horizontal structure, and if like there is like one person, even one person, or like few people, like in some city, we unite and we connect to each other and we work together. And the things we are doing, quite impressive. And also, I'm not in a position to tell you all about their activities. Some of them are public and you can find about it. Some of them is not public for obvious reasons. So there are some other movements in Russia, like anarchist movement, leftist movement, liberal movements, and we are doing their work. And though it's not public, we should find a way to contact them and to ask them, what help do you need? How we can support you, right? What we can provide for you. There is another way which is quite essential for people who don't like revolution. I don't like revolution myself. I saw revolutions as a reporter. It's ugly thing, but unfortunately it's not only one way out right now, right? So another thing is that information is key. People in Russia are so disinformed and so detached from reality because they're facing two things. First, criminalization of journalism as a profession, blockage of enormous amount of websites. Just for last half a year, 855,000 internet websites were blocked or deleted in Russian internet. It's a lot. And on the other hand, we have enormous, sophisticated, smart, very talented and very, very, very well-founded propaganda, right? So people got detached from reality, and this is dangerous. So what we can do from here is to help them to go back into this reality. And that's not going to be easy, but it's what we can do. And what's happening right now, it's kind of race of technologies between state programmers and programmers who are helping like independent media, because they learn how to block us, we learn how to avoid the blockage, then we learn how to stop us from avoiding the blockage, then we find another way around. So it's what's happening right now. So if you have any, IT skills or friends in ITs, hackers, yeah, you're like very, very, very welcome. To help us, we would be so happy about it. And another thing, what all Russians need, they need some support, because, you know, we want from Russian people to realize a very terrible thing, actually. We want them to realize that in their country there is fascism, and that our country is attacking Ukraine and killing civilians. And it's quite a big thing to, you know, to live with. And right now, many Russians I know who like from abroad, and I feel it myself, like you cannot even let yourself to feel anything, because if you feel sad or angry, you're like, okay, I can't be sad and angry. Like, think about Ukrainian people, like they can be sad and angry, I cannot. If I feel like happy about something, or I can't be happy, people are dying right now. So in that case, I believe some simple message like, we see you, we understand you, and we support you would be super helpful, though it's not very easy to support Russian people right now, but I believe it might help.
Thank you very much. Anything to contribute to that question?
I very much hope that there won't be a revolution in Russia. I honestly pray for that not to be happening, because it's about violence, and it's about, you know, somebody's children dying. And usually these are not the children of the oligarchs. These are not the children of the people in power, like the ones fighting in Ukraine. You know, I remember sitting in Donetsk, and Mr. Poroshenko was the president of Ukraine. He had two sons. None of them were fighting in Donbass. From the Ukrainian side, these were poor boys from the western parts of Ukraine who looked like 8 years old, and they were 20 years old, you know, with bad teeth and bad skin, and, you know, and poor. And I could see even some of these soldiers taking, you know, windows like Evra Remont, taking the European type of windows back home to Western Ukraine from Donetsk, because Donetsk and Donbass were quite a rich region. Not because they were kind of some, you know, arch criminals, but they just liked it because they didn't have it. Now the Russian army is seen from very poor regions to be, you know, dragging from Ukraine these, you know, toilet seats and half of how do you say it, of a teapot, you know, electrical teapot, but without the electrical part of it, because, you know, yes, because when in Buryatia, the only available profession for men is to join the police or to join the army, because it's so poor that there is no other way to make a living and to feed your family. I think, what's the answer? I hope it's peaceful. I don't believe in revolutions and violence. I'm sorry, I'm from a different school of beliefs. I believe that more weapons leads to more death. I believe that as humanity, if we were capable 75 years ago to come up with this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that we're talking about it now, this year, it's 75 years. And somehow after World War II, which was an awful, awful war, right? I mean, from what we've seen, what we've read about, still the humanity found a way of sitting together and coming up with this dream document, which is still not realized, you know, about equality, about rights, about civil and political, but also social and economic rights. I truly believe that with all our knowledge, our generation is capable of doing that as well. But, you know, we have to bring some honesty to this picture. And I was talking about it. It's, we're talking about Ukraine because it's our European war, right? I mean, because it's white people, God forbid, they're suffering. I'm sorry, you know, I was in Donetsk. I am from this region. But there are other places in the world. How do we bring the Africans to pay attention to us? Or how do we bring the Latin Americans or other people that have been having these conflicts in their places? We have to be honest to have that map of the world. And when we're talking of one conflict and try to resolve it, we probably have to, in parallel, talk about other conflicts and have a solution, not just for one country, but for a region or for a part of the world. I think it's too much politics, you know. One war is paid attention to because it's more special than others. Other people are left for 30 years, like in Congo or in Afghanistan. I mean, we saw what happened in Afghanistan, honestly. This was arch dishonesty of international politics. For 30 years, teaching girls that they have the right to go to university and schools, and then departing and leaving them to be under the burqa and being, you know, violated and not allowed to have their human rights. I mean, where is the honesty in this? And I think I can only ask questions at the moment because I'm struggling like you to come up with answers about what's the way forward, but I hope it's peaceful. We cannot just go after one tyrant without looking that there's so many tyrants around. And it's not just one, there are many
Some
in today's world.
Other tyrants. And I think
Sure,
Putin
but
is certainly one of those that is actually currently facilitating tyrants in Africa and a lot of.
Sure, but what do we do? Of course, yes, Wagner is in half of Africa, the Wagner mercenaries. The people in Niger, after the coup d'etat, I was shocked they had the Russian flag rather than their own. I mean, I'm sure they don't even know where Russia is. Right. But is that, I mean, if we start kind of talking of violent ways of toppling dictators, we'll turn into silent troikas, me, you, and Elena, you know, armed, and we go after this dictator and another one. Who decides? You know, I think we have the system of international law. I do believe in it. And by the way, United Nations does not impose sanctions. It's political unions like the European Union or other unions or individual governments like the US government or the UK government. It's not the United Nations. And, you know, there are sanctions which are about economic sanctions. They never work. They didn't work in Iran. They won't work in Belarus or Russia. And there are sanctions like the Magnitsky Law, where one goes after the perpetrators of torture, of human rights violations. These are different packages of sanctions. So we have to be clear what we're talking about. But I do believe we need a discussion, an honest one, a dialogue about these conflicts outside the politics and outside the fashion of politics, if you know what I mean. And this conflict is more, you know, we like it because it's people like us. Other conflicts we don't because they're black or yellow or whatever. It's a dishonest time we live in. It's a post-truth time. It's a post-COVID time as well. Half of the humanity, I think, lost their mind during COVID. We were isolated for too long. But the answer is not violence. Never. It's never a violence. That's what I believe in.
Thank you. No, Sergei, I'm going to go to you because we now have two choices, revolution or an approach through non-violent revolutionary means. And no, I'm not choosing a side. I want you to choose a side, Sergei.
Actually, I would say that
No violence is not what we want in downtown New York. We're violent people in New York.
I would say that it is not an issue of choice, but an issue of prediction. You said that you expected that revolution will take place. I think there were no grounds to expect a revolution in Russia. Something similar with or strikes. Any united collective action is impossible. It is impossible because we unfortunately do not have sufficient historical experience, and living people do not have such a personal experience. And the state have made huge efforts to eliminate any possibility of any cooperative collective action. Russian society is very atomized. And it differs, for example, from Ukrainian and Belarusian society because it doesn't, the Russian state doesn't depend on the society. It depends on raw materials. And it can refuse to get any taxes from people at all. It doesn't depend on their productivity and so on. And there are some many other reasons. We cannot discuss all of them. But anyway, tactically, it's impossible to expect that people become so unsatisfied with Putin then take sticks or I don't know what and throw Putin away from Kremlin. It's really impossible situation because the state monopolizes all the resources of the state, and people are feeling their helplessness. Excuse me. But strategically, we should foresee that this regime cannot live a relatively long time because it doesn't answer the challenges Russia faces, and it will lose international competition. It loses it now, and we know that generally, according to the stances and values of Russian population, Russian people are Europeans, and natural answer to these challenges for them is European. And Putin himself made this situation absolutely unstable. And Prigozhin's mutiny showed that unpredictable thing can happen. So we cannot predict an exact scenario, but we can predict that in some limited time, this regime will somehow disappear, but it can happen because of combination of factors which can be very random and unpredictable.
We have time for a few more questions.
Should be
One
a
more
few
question?
minutes, just a few more minutes.
3 more minutes left. Oh, sorry. Yes. One more question, and we'll have some quick answers to that question if anyone wants to ask. There were rumors yesterday that Putin had a heart attack, but I think they were just rumors. He fell and hit his head and was unconscious, but one can only hope. But no questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been so incredible, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Can I just say that the final words of this gathering could be the ones on the T-shirt of this lady here on the first row. Everything is moving towards the better. Yeah, все катится к лучшему.